Phedon Papamichael, uh, let's start before we get into the actual cinematography of Nebraska. Let's talk about its story, this journey, this father-son road trip that involves a confused old man, grumpy old guy, I would say, who really believes he's won this sweepstakes. We all know he hasn't. The son know he hasn't, but it's one of those very deceptive flyers you get in the mail. And the journey that begins from there is so poignant. I think I'm not the only one in the world who thought, that's my father up there. You know, a little bit of our father, all of our dads are up there, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been able to watch a movie with various audiences, a lot of Midwesterners, and especially people who grew up in communities and societies of that size or in the Midwest. I think it really rings home a lot of truth to them. So this lack of communication, isolation, the loneliness in these towns, and everybody I think has either a parent or relative that reminds him of Woody, our character. And I mean, Alexander himself, I mean, he didn't write this particular screenplay, but he has a 91-year-old mother and a 99-year-old father. So I'm sure, we've everybody has similar dealings at one point or another with a relative or a father. So although it's a stylized picture, it's just by its pure nature being black and white and stuff, but it still creates, it's always a great compliment when we talk to the local communities where we shoot in. The same was the case with Descendants, where a lot of Hawaiians, islanders said, you guys really captured the essence of, what reality is living in Hawaii, living on these islands. And it's not just what the tourist office represents or likes to represent in the brochures and just the Waikiki Beach. And it's, it's the traffic, the poverty, and the same with the Midwest. I mean, people who know these communities really feel a lot of truth in the story. And of course it's stylized, and it's poetic and cinematic, but still the essence of the emotions and sort of these key themes that we have seem very true and real. So at least it's affecting people in a way where you feel like it's hitting them in the heart, and something that they've experienced and felt. The emotions seem authentic.
So why black and white?
Well, why black and white? It's a question, of course, we get asked all the time. Alexander, I mean, the comment he makes sometimes, it's like his mom finally got to see the movie and she goes, "Oh, now I know why you guys wanted to do this in black and white. It's because it wouldn't have been as good in color." But something about it just helps this particular story. I think in a way it's more realistic, although of course it's not. But I always say, when I started as a still photographer, and even today in the digital world, I mean, I used to have two cameras on my shoulder. I had a camera with black and white film loaded, and I had a camera with color film loaded. That's how we ran around. And sometimes you just reach for the black and white camera and you decide that's an image that should be black and white. And I really feel like it applies to this story. It underlines all these sort of themes. The vastness of the landscape, the graphic value of the huge horizons, the sky, our little lonely figures, and of course Woody being the central key character. Just the way he looks visually, I mean, his white hair glowing and his textured face, it allows us not to be distracted by any kind of palette, and just really take in the textures and his expressions, the subtleties of his little looks. And he becomes this symbolic figure of death in a way, without getting too Bergman-esque, but it's just this ghostly figure of sort of loneliness and isolation. And I think in all of that, the black and white helps. I mean, besides that, in terms of an intellectual approach, it really, when Alexander first mentioned this movie to me, which is 10 years ago, we were prepping Sideways, he said, "I have a small movie in Nebraska, my home state, and it's going to be in black and white." So it always just existed in black and white in our minds. We never conceived it any other way. as part of our early prep, we took on this road trip. I met Alexander in Billings, Nebraska, which is where the journey initiates, and the two of us drove down in his mom's Toyota Corolla, and we drove the full trip over 3 days. And of course, I brought a black and white still camera. It's an X-Pan, so it's sort of a scope aspect ratio, and all the first initial images and were in black and white, of course, and we printed them, and so this movie always just had a reality in black and white for us. And that trip really just served a purpose. It wasn't even the location scout. It was really Alexander just wanted me to get a sense of the land and the distances, and how vast these places are. And we would drive into these towns, and it'd say population 16,000 or 22,000, and we'd drive down Main Street typically just to get a look. And I'd never see any people on the streets, and I say, "You're from here. Where is everybody? Where are all the people?" And I had just come from Italy, and you drive into a small town in Italy, and there are kids running across the piazza, and there's some old men drinking coffee, and I'd never see anyone. And he'd say, "Well, I guess you're inside watching TV." I don't know. It was like a nice fall afternoon, 70 degrees, and it's just people are in the houses. And I just had friends who came, Christmas, everyone traveled home, they came back from Texas or Minnesota or wherever they visited their relatives over Christmas, and they go, "There's just always a football game on," and all the conversations happen really without eye contact. People are it's just the constant presence of some kind of, college football game or bowl game, and everybody is just talking really and looking at the screen. You just can't help yourself, even if you're not coming from that kind of society. You just end up mesmerized looking at the game. And we have, ironically, or I should say, months later when we did the movie, of course, there are all these scenes where people are just sort of, this minimalist conversations that take place, in the presence of the television. And those have turned out to be key scenes in the movie, which was funny because those were my first impressions, when Alexander introduced me to this world.
Wow. Now, Dern's character is so quiet himself and not very expressive. It's hard for us in the audience to get under to see what he's thinking. So that's your job. That's the camera has got to get into his heart and soul. And on one hand, as you mentioned, you have this film filled with all these magnificent epic landscapes. And then you've got to zero in very close into this stubborn mind of a grumpy old man. Do you have a philosophy or technique of doing that psychologically, I guess?
The landscapes, like you mentioned, are so vast, and they lend themselves to these wide shots. When we designed the style of shooting, we wanted to really have a slower pace that reflects sort of the mood and the lifestyle of how these people go through their days. So we have minimal coverage. They're pretty simple shots. Often we have these masters that we try to play them out in a single shot. There's a few of them that stand out and that are very successful, like All the Brothers Watching TV. That shot gets a laugh before the dialogue even starts. When that image appears on screen, it's already getting a reaction from the audience. And same, similar situations in the graveyard when they visit the cemetery. A lot of those play in these sort of prolonged masters with just very specific moments. We go into these close-ups, and it's not your standard coverage where you just shoot a master and overs and coverage and close-up on everybody. When we do choose to go in and hone in on Bruce's face and his expressions, those are very selective moments, and it gives them more strength because we're not overusing them. But of course, having an object or having an actor like Bruce and discovering the subtleties of his expressions and the little looks, that reflect sort of confusion and sadness or disappointment. Those are moments that we really cherish, and we restrained ourselves not to really overuse them. So, but the times we do, then they become quite effective. So.